They came before dawn. Creeping over the city's edges, silent, deliberate, unseen. A trailer idled under streetlights. The hiss of air brakes broke the night. A handful of men in black jackets and scarves, faces hidden, eyes burning red under the glow of brake lights. In the distance, the factories still smoked. The border crossing still carried its cargo. The city still believed in tomorrow. But tonight, the city did not believe. Because in the hush before sunrise, something shifted. They were not tourists. They were not officials. They were the bearers of a new covenant. Control by gunfire, message by blood, territory by threat. Factories closed. The whistles didn't blow. The hum of night commuters faded to a whisper. Even the streetlights flickered, as if afraid. Juarez was never supposed to become a war zone. Not like this. Not so visibly. Not with thousands dying in their own streets. Yet by the time the smoke cleared, 11,000 were gone. 11,000 lives. 11,000 names that never made the front pages. 11,000 silent phones that never rang again. 11,000 homes left incomplete. Pause, low bass note, like a heartbeat. The war didn't begin with a roar. It began with a thud, then a tremor, then a blast that everyone heard. But too many ignored. In 2008, Juarez was humming. A border city booming with factories, nightlife, and dreams. The Rio Grande carried the sound of commerce, not gunfire. But when rival cartels, the Juárez Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel, collided for control of the routes, the city's heartbeat changed. One day you passed an assembly plant where 3 shifts built electronics. The next, a checkpoint manned by masked soldiers who didn't wear badges. The world of legality and the world of gunmen blurred until no one could tell the difference. By 2010, Juarez recorded over 3,100 murders in a single year. Its worst in modern history. That's 8 people, every day. Gone. A body in the street wasn't news. It was routine. And as the toll climbed, the silence deepened. What changed first? The men with guns? The deals made in dimly lit rooms? The trucks loaded with cocaine and assault rifles crossing from the U.S.? All of it. And more. The police, once protectors, became another ledger entry. Some vanished. Some switched sides. Some took the money. The law was no longer law, it was a business decision. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. That was the choice. Take the bribe, or take the bullet. In neighborhoods where children once played until dusk, whispers replaced laughter. Mothers taught their kids to peek from behind curtains. Men took alternate routes home, hoping not to cross the wrong vehicle. Businesses shuttered at dusk. A single day without bloodshed was front-page news. And still, the city kept moving. Because life had to. Factories reopened. Bridges still carried trucks. The border never stopped. Normalcy became a mask. But normal never meant safe. When the first corpse turned up in a ditch, people whispered. When 50 more appeared, they still whispered. But when thousands vanished, when bodies filled morgues faster than they could be identified, the question changed from who was it to when will it be me? And too many found the answer. Distant echo of gunfire, fading siren. The geography of death shifted. Shopping malls, clinics, schools. Every corner carried a story of blood. Bodies hung from bridges like warnings. Empty cars burned under the afternoon sun. No neighborhood was untouchable. Across the border in El Paso, The gunfire echoed. Faint but undeniable. Families locked their doors earlier. Headlines whispered of a war too close for comfort. The U.S.Mexico border was no longer a line. It was a mirror, reflecting the demand on one side and the destruction on the other. Every bullet fired in Juarez had a path that started somewhere else. Every dollar that changed hands had a ripple that ended in a grave. But this isn't just a story of guns and drugs. It's a story of people. Of workers, mothers, students. Ordinary lives that slipped into extraordinary danger. Every number hides a name. Every streetlight hides a memory. Every sunrise hides another body not yet found. 11,000. Say it slowly. 11,000. Not a headline. Not a statistic. A wound that never healed. The warning signs were always there. But they whispered, not screamed. And when they finally screamed, no one could hear over the sound of gunfire. There was no single explosion that started it all. No one villain to point to. It was erosion, then collapse. A slow rot that began with greed and ended in fear. Death walked freely through Juarez. In pickup beds. In black SUVs. In men whose eyes were colder than steel. They left calling cards in the form of bodies hanging from overpasses. Messages carved into flesh. Graves dug shallow, waiting for the next delivery. This was Mexico's longest drug war. A war that pulsed, paused, and roared again. One cartel fell, and 10 others took its place. Every victory birthed a new monster. But this story is not only about cartels. It's about a city. A city that once believed in light. And found itself swallowed by its own shadow. It's about a border where one nation wakes up to freedom. And the other to fear. It's about mothers who search for their sons through morgues and deserts. Children who learn to sleep through gunfire. Workers who built devices by day and dug graves by night. And yet, Juarez still breathes. It still hopes. It still fights to be remembered for more than its dead. Because this story is not over. Short silence, then low cinematic music begins building up. Tonight, we begin at the start of the fall. When the factories still opened. When the city still worked. When Juarez still believed in sunrise. Before the horizon turned red. Before the number, 11,000, was ever spoken aloud. Stay with me. Because in the ashes of this city, we will find not just how it fell, but what it cost to rise again. When the sun rose over the Rio Grande, the city of Ciudad Juarez greeted another shift. Workers poured into the maquiladora plants, churches opened their doors, children pressed backpacks over their shoulders and headed to school. The border crossing hummed, trucks rolled north carrying goods, hope, and sometimes more than the manifest claimed. In that regular rhythm, morning, shift change, dinner, sleep, a promise of normalcy lived in every honk of a horn and clatter of a railcar. Juarez was built on possibility. A city that sat at the edge of two countries, a gateway between the United States and Mexico. It was also a city of migrants, men and women drawn from all corners of Mexico, chasing wages, dreams, the chance to make something of tomorrow. By the turn of the century, Juarez had grown fast, its factories, its border trade, its promise of work. Wikipedia +2 Wikipedia +2. The humming machines of the maquilas were the new heartbeats of the city. Wikipedia +1. In one direction you saw the bright lights of industry, in the other, the desert winds sweeping over barrios where houses were built quickly, cheaply, to keep up with demand. Open factory gates meant opportunity. But those gates also opened new vulnerabilities: rapid expansion, weak oversight, and a population working hard, earning little, and trusting in a future that felt close but never quite arrived. For many families, the promise was simple: work the day, send money home, build a small house, see your children go farther than you did. In those early hours you could walk the factories and feel it: the hum of drills, the smell of solder, the clink of plastic parts snapping into place. But you might also feel something else beneath it, a tension you couldn't name. A fault line drifting under the city's surface. Because Juarez had history, too, older than its factories. Violence had visited before, when the border was a crossing point for prohibition, a transfer zone for goods and people that no one tracked fully. El Universal Interactivos. And now, this history would combine with something new. The city would ask of itself, what happens when the border shifts from trade to trafficking, when the factories stay, but the shadows at their gates grow deeper? Factories employed tens of thousands, women and men lined up early, badges clipped to their uniforms, their lunchboxes folded in paper bags. Young women often found the assembly lines the best way out of small towns. Young men stepped into machine rooms or weld stations hoping for stability. But stability was fragile. Labor conditions were harsh. Long shifts, low pay, and a sense that the margin between job and jobless was thinner than ever. Wikipedia +1. The city lived in that tension, between the rising skyline of industry and the narrow street behind where a single street lamp might flicker and die. In the evenings, the border city still had its nightlife: tacos under neon signs, families strolling along Avenida Revolution, children chasing stray dogs in the alleyways. But the growth had come fast. Neighborhoods sprouted around the factories. Houses built hurry up, people poured in. The infrastructure struggled to keep up. Schools were crowded, clinics overworked, parks few. In that urban sprawl you found the seeds of unrest: workers exhausted, wages stretched, social services weak. The city's growth outpaced its ability to absorb it. Yet you wouldn't have known it during the day. The factories still ticked. The freight trains still rolled. The border still opened and closed in its rhythm. Juarez still believed it was functioning. It still believed it was safe. For now. And then the whispers began. It was a woman walking home late from her shift, glancing over her shoulder. It was a truck that didn't stop at the checkpoint. It was a payday loan storefront closing early. No one rang the alarm. But the city listened. Men who once punched in their time cards began answering other calls. Police officers who once drove patrols now rode in unmarked cars. The lines between commerce, law enforcement, and organized crime began to blur. By the time the city recognized the change, the grid had shifted. On a morning like any other, you might have stopped for coffee at a street stand. Across from you a worker in a blue uniform, next to him a kid who hung around. They both nodded. The factory whistle blew at 6 a.m. In that moment you thought you were safe. But the city had already moved into a new gear. When the first body was found, discarded in a trash-filled lot just beyond the factory walls, the reaction was muted. Another drunk, someone said. Just an accident, someone else added. But it wasn't. Because the next body turned up at the end of the production line. Then another. Then dozens. And the city didn't know how to hold its sorrow. Juarez was still alive, still loud, still exporting parts and promise. But beneath its hum lay a darkness that would soon wake. The city before the war is the story of what was at stake: a border town with two futures, one of hope, one of fear. And both existed in the same asphalt. In this chapter of our story you'll see how the grid of factories, the beam of the border lights, the dream of every commuter, those were what made Juarez a target. and how that target was always moving. Because in the end the city didn't fall all at once. It slipped. And the night it slipped, the factories still opened their gates. But the doors locked behind a changed city. So prepare yourself. Because the day we thought was safe, was the day the war began. By the mid-1980s, Ciudad Juárez was no longer just a border city. It was becoming a corridor of ambition and corruption. Behind the steady rhythm of factory shifts and border traffic, something else was awakening. A new kind of business. A business that would turn this industrial city into the epicenter of Mexico's longest and bloodiest drug war. And at the center of it all, stood one man. Amado Carrillo Fuentes. They called him El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. Soft drone fades in, the hum of airplane engines. He wasn't born into power. He came from the dusty fields of Sinaloa, the same soil that raised some of Mexico's most infamous drug traffickers. But Amado was different. He didn't crave the spotlight. He built an empire from the shadows, one shipment, one flight, one silent deal at a time. By the 1990s, his fleet of private jets crisscrossed the Americas, ferrying tons of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico. Then up through Juarez, across the Rio Grande, and straight into the veins of the United States. Juarez, the city of labor and hope, had become the most profitable gateway for narcotics on earth. The same roads used by maquiladora trucks. The same warehouses filled with electronics and auto parts. Now hit a different kind of cargo. Drugs. Weapons. Money. And death. How did it happen? Simple. When the right deals were made. The right pockets were filled. And the right men were silenced. Amado Carrillo wasn't just a smuggler. He was an architect. He designed an empire that functioned like a corporation, structured, disciplined, brutally efficient. Pilots were trained like soldiers. Accountants handled millions through shell companies. And politicians? They were shareholders, whether they knew it or not. Under his command, the Juárez Cartel became a transnational machine. A system where loyalty meant survival, and betrayal meant a grave in the desert. In 1993, Amado made his most ruthless move. He eliminated his mentor, Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, and seized control of the entire Juárez network. From that moment on, the city belonged to him. And his power? It didn't come from bullets. It came from the sky. With planes capable of carrying over 10 tons of cocaine per flight, Amado earned his nickname, the Lord of the Skies. While law enforcement tracked convoys and border crossings, Amado flew far above their reach. Each landing meant millions. Each takeoff, another victory. The profits were so vast, U.S. officials later estimated that he laundered over $200 million a month through banks and dummy corporations. Juárez was printing money and spilling blood. But here's the irony. To the average worker, life still looked the same. The factories opened. The buses still ran. The border crossings still beeped with scanners and customs stamps. People saw growth. They saw progress. But they didn't see who was really funding it. When the cartel thrived, so did the city. New neighborhoods rose. Businesses flourished. And behind every new construction permit, a bribe. Behind every police promotion, a favor. Behind every disappearance, a warning. This was the golden age of the Juárez Cartel. A time when its leaders moved like ghosts, untouchable, untraceable, and armed with the world's most powerful weapon, money. They called it plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe, or take the bullet. And in Juárez, most men chose silver. Short pause. Sound, faint click of a revolver spinning, then fading into silence. The government looked the other way. Some officials became partners. Others simply vanished. And those who tried to fight, journalists, prosecutors, honest officers, paid with their lives. The cartel wasn't just a criminal organization. It had become the system itself. Factories ran on its money. Neighborhoods relied on its favors. Even the poorest families were fed by someone connected to the business. Juarez was thriving, on borrowed time. Low bass pulse, heartbeat-like rhythm. Because empires built on fear eventually rot from within. And Amado Carrillo Fuentes knew it. The walls were closing in. By 1997, U.S. intelligence and Mexican authorities were closing the circle around him. The DA had names. The press had questions. And Amado had one last escape plan. A new face. He underwent plastic surgery, a desperate attempt to vanish, to live unseen in a new identity. But it didn't go as planned. He died on the operating table, his body swollen, unrecognizable. The Lord of the Skies had fallen. But his death didn't end the empire. It splintered it. And in that vacuum, chaos exploded. Rival factions rose from within. Loyalists turned on each other. And the once unified Juárez cartel began to fracture, piece by piece, street by street, bullet by bullet. What came next would redefine Mexico's war on drugs forever. In the next chapter, the peace dies. The alliances collapse. And the city of Juárez, once humming with industry, becomes a battlefield. A war zone where 11,000 lives would be lost in less than a decade. This was only the beginning. When Amado Carrillo Fuentes died on that operating table in 1997, it didn't bring peace. It unleashed chaos. The empire he built, disciplined, structured, almost corporate, suddenly had no leader. And where power cracks, vultures gather. The Juárez cartel splintered. Inside, old lieutenants turned rivals. Outside, predators smelled blood. And no predator was hungrier than the Sinaloa Cartel. Led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Sinaloa was expanding, fast, violent, and ruthless. They saw Juárez not just as a rival city, but as the most valuable gate to the United States. Control Juárez, control the flow. Control the flow, control the fortune. What began as quiet assassinations soon became open war. Block by block. Family by family. Street by street. At first, people whispered it. Another killing here. A body there. But by 2008, the whispers had turned into roars. Entire neighborhoods became front lines. This wasn't just cartel against cartel anymore, it was cartel against the city itself. Police, journalists, and even soldiers found themselves trapped between invisible lines. The Sinaloa Cartel struck first, aligning with corrupt officials, recruiting local gangs as foot soldiers, and using terror as currency. In response, the Juárez Cartel armed its own militia, La Línea, a faction of former and active police officers. The line between law and crime vanished completely. Uniforms meant nothing now. Daylight shootings. Ambushes on highways. Entire families executed to send a message. Messages written not with words, but with bullets. And the city, once full of factories and dreams, began to drown. Between 2008 and 2012, over 11,000 people were killed in Juárez. 11,000. Every shot echoing through a city that had already lost its innocence. Schools closed. Businesses boarded up. Families fled north, leaving houses abandoned, ghosts on every block. At night, You could hear it, silence broken by gunfire, then silence again. Journalists called it the deadliest city on earth. The United Nations called it a humanitarian crisis. But for those who lived there, it was simply home. A home that no longer recognized itself. Bodies were dumped in the desert, along highways, in canals, under bridges. Mass graves appeared on the city's outskirts. And even those who had nothing to do with the war, children, factory workers, students, became collateral. This wasn't just about drugs anymore. It was about dominance. Control. Survival. Sinaloa wanted the trade routes. Juarez wanted revenge. And caught in between were the people. Every night, news anchors read names. Every morning, those names were forgotten, replaced by new ones. Each week, the numbers grew. Each year, the city slipped deeper into despair. And yet, life continued. Factories still opened. Children still went to school. People still fell in love, still prayed, still hoped that tomorrow might finally be quiet. That maybe, somehow, the killing would stop. But Juarez had become the front line of Mexico's war on drugs, a war that didn't end at borders or policies. It lived in the alleys, in the air, in the heartbeat of every citizen too afraid to speak. The Mexican government sent in the military. Humvees rolled through the streets. Soldiers guarded intersections. But soldiers can't heal fear. And bullets don't build trust. By 2010, Juarez felt like two cities. One living in daylight, factories, schools, and markets. And one buried in darkness, the city of the dead, where deals were made and scores were settled. When night fell, the two cities traded places. And only one ever woke up again. But even in chaos, the cartels adapted. They learned to hide violence behind normal life. They bought politicians, bank managers, and journalists. And they made sure every act of terror had a witness, because fear was the best advertisement. If you asked a Juarez resident then, who controls your street? They wouldn't answer. Because answering could be fatal. The war wasn't just between men with guns. It was between truth and silence. And silence was winning. As 2011 came, the world was watching. Documentaries. Journalists. Foreign governments. Everyone had an opinion. But only the people of Juarez knew what it felt like to live it, to walk through empty neighborhoods where even dogs stopped barking. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the killings slowed. The reason? No one's sure. Some say Sinaloa won the war. Others say the city simply ran out of people to kill. By 2012, the death toll dropped. The headlines faded. And the world moved on. But Juarez didn't. The scars stayed. The fear lingered. And the ghosts? They never left. Today, you can drive through Juarez and see both versions of the city. The modern skyline. The bustling trade routes. And the memorials, crosses lining the roads, names carved into walls, families still searching for the missing. The war may have ended on paper. But its shadow still walks those streets. The fall of Juarez wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 choices, made over decades, by the powerful, the desperate, and the forgotten. Choices that turned a city of workers into a city of graves. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. When a city builds its future on fear, that future always comes back to collect. The war ended. But the silence that followed was louder than the gunfire. Juarez had survived, but barely. The streets still smelled of smoke and metal. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. and the air carried something invisible, something heavier than grief. It was absence. Absence of laughter. Absence of safety. Absence of life. The headlines called it peace. But in Juarez, it felt like a truce between ghosts. By 2013, the government declared victory. Officials smiled for cameras, saying the city was on the path to recovery. But ask anyone who lived there, and they'd tell you the truth. Juarez wasn't healing. It was hiding. Whole neighborhoods had vanished. Factories shut down, their windows shattered and rusting. Schools stood empty. And the people who had fled to El Paso, across the border, never came back. At night, the city still trembled, not from explosions, but from memories. A car backfiring could send a man diving for cover. A knock on the door after dark could freeze a woman's heart. Children grew up learning not to look too long at anyone, because staring could still get you killed. The war had changed Juarez. But more than that, it had changed its people. They no longer trusted the police. They no longer believed in justice. And most of all, they no longer believed in safety. The survivors called it la costumbre del miedo, the habit of fear. It wasn't panic anymore. It was routine. Lock the doors. Don't answer unknown calls. Don't ask questions. Don't hope. Every family had a story. A cousin disappeared. A brother taken. A father never came home. And every story ended the same way, with silence. Because in Juarez, speaking still meant dying. But even silence has cracks. By 2014, something began to stir beneath the fear. Mothers, ordinary women, started marching through the streets, holding up pictures of the missing. They weren't cartel bosses or politicians. They were factory workers, shopkeepers, teachers, women who refused to let their children become statistics. They called themselves Las Buscadoras, the searchers. And every weekend, they walked into the desert with shovels and hope. Looking for bones. Looking for answers. Looking for peace. The authorities told them to stop. They didn't. Because if the government wouldn't find their loved ones, they would. And so, Juarez became a different kind of battlefield, one where courage fought despair, one grave at a time. Yet, while the mothers searched, the cartels rebuilt. Quieter now. Smarter. Less blood, more money. The Sinaloa Cartel had claimed victory, but it wasn't the same Sinaloa anymore. Their leadership fractured, Guzman captured, escaped, captured again. Others rose in his place, men who learned from Juarez's destruction, men who knew that sometimes, terror doesn't need bullets, only influence. Juarez became a blueprint. A lesson in control through chaos. And in that lesson, the cartels across Mexico found a new way to rule, not by war, but by fear's memory. You see, the war never truly ended. It just changed shape. The killings became selective. The corruption became sophisticated. And the silence, that old, familiar silence, became the new order. By 2016, Juarez began to attract attention again. Not for its murders, but for its rebirth. Investors returned. Businesses reopened. Tourists crossed the border once more. The government called it a miracle. But underneath the surface, people whispered. The ghosts are still here. Because the truth was simple, Juarez hadn't healed, it had adapted. The same networks that once smuggled cocaine now moved cash, weapons, and influence. The same men who once commanded soldiers now wore suits. The same streets that once ran with blood now glimmered with glass towers. And yet, in every reflection, you could still see the scars. Ask a taxi driver about those years, and his eyes will shift. He'll say, "Things are better now." Then he'll pause and lower his voice. "But don't go out after dark." Ask a shopkeeper, and she'll smile nervously. She'll tell you the city is safe, but her hand will tremble when the doorbell rings. Ask the children, the ones who grew up through it, and they'll tell you stories of what they saw. Things they should never have seen. Bodies. Shootings. Fear so thick it felt like dust in their lungs. They'll tell you they don't remember names, only sounds. Gunfire. Sirens. Screams. And silence. To them, the war isn't history. It's inheritance. And that's the tragedy of Juarez. The war ended, but the fear became part of its DNA. It passed from one generation to the next, quiet, invisible, but always there. By 2018, murals began appearing on walls across the city. Portraits of the dead. Names painted in color where blood once stained the ground. A mother's way of saying, "We remember." Even if the world forgot. And through it all, one truth remained: Juarez was never just a city. It was a mirror. A reflection of a country torn between survival and surrender. A warning that no war truly ends when its wounds are ignored. The factories are open again. The music plays in bars. Life goes on. But every so often, someone disappears. No headlines. No justice. Just another ghost in the city of ghosts. Because Juarez never forgot what it learned in blood. That peace is fragile. That silence can be deadly. And that sometimes, the war doesn't end. It just waits. And as the sun sets over the Rio Grande, casting long shadows across the desert, you can almost feel them. The echoes of those who never made it home. Whispering through the streets they once walked. Reminding anyone who listens that history never stays buried for long. The war for Juarez left more than bodies behind. It left blueprints. While the world mourned the victims, something else began to grow in the shadows, silent, invisible, and far more dangerous than the violence itself. A new kind of empire. One without battlefields, without uniforms, without borders. This was the era of the shadow network. When the cartels realized that war brought too much attention, they changed their strategy. Guns were replaced with influence. Territory with technology. Fear with control. Juarez, once the symbol of chaos, became the testing ground for a new kind of order, an order built on corruption so deep, it became part of the system itself. The drug trade didn't disappear. It evolved. Cocaine routes still ran through the city, but the real power now flowed through bank accounts, shell companies, and government contracts. The same men who had ordered killings now sat in boardrooms. The same killers who once patrolled alleys now worked as private security. And the same city that once burned, now glimmered with investment money that no one dared question. For the cartels, war had simply gone digital. They laundered billions through crypto wallets, construction projects, and offshore trusts. They built front businesses so clean that even international banks didn't blink. And all of it, every deal, every dollar, traced back to the ghosts of Juarez. It's easy to think of cartels as chaos. But in truth, they thrive on structure. They adapt faster than governments, learn quicker than corporations, and recruit with promises that sound like hope. In Juarez, young men who once carried rifles now carried laptops. They were hackers, analysts, brokers. They built encrypted systems, coded payment routes, and moved money faster than the authorities could trace. The war had taught them one thing: survival requires evolution. And they evolved brilliantly. By 2020, Juárez's cartel influence reached far beyond Mexico, Europe, Africa, Asia. Their fingerprints were everywhere. Not on street corners anymore, but on stock markets, real estate, and even politics. The border city once drenched in blood now held the keys to a silent global empire. And that's the irony. The quieter Juárez became, the more powerful it grew. Behind every new shopping mall was a shell company. Behind every luxury hotel, a laundered fortune. Behind every politician's campaign, a donation with no name. The violence had simply gone underground. Invisible. Efficient. Perfectly legal on paper. The cartels no longer needed to kill to control. They just needed to invest. It was no longer about who held the gun. It was about who signed the contract. For the average citizen, life looked normal again. Children returned to school. The city lights shone bright. The economy boomed. But beneath the glow, corruption moved like blood through veins. Unseen, unstoppable, essential. The ghosts of Juárez had found new forms. They wore suits instead of masks. They smiled instead of threatened. And they operated in silence, because silence had always been their strongest weapon. Investigative journalists tried to expose them. Some disappeared. Others fled. A few survived, and told stories of how deep the web ran. One journalist described it like this. It's not that the cartels infiltrated the system. They became the system. And that's what Juárez represented now, not war, but transformation. A city reborn not through peace, but through adaptation. It's a warning. Because when violence becomes business, and fear becomes policy, justice no longer stands a chance. In Juárez, the lines blurred long ago. And now, they've vanished completely. Today, the same highways that once carried convoys of armed men now carry shipments of legitimate goods, hidden among them, the untraceable cargo that keeps the machine alive. Money moves faster than bullets ever did. And corruption travels farther than any cartel convoy could dream. In the daylight, Juárez looks like a success story, a city that rose from its own ashes. But in the quiet of night, when the city sleeps, the deals are still being made. The network hums. And somewhere, in a corner office overlooking the desert, a man counts money that will never see a tax record. This is the new cartel war, one fought with keyboards, influence, and silence. A war without heroes, without headlines, without end. Because the shadow network doesn't need chaos to survive. It needs normalcy. The illusion of peace. The comfort of forgetting. And that's the tragedy of Juárez. The blood dried. The gunfire stopped. But the machine kept running. The same engine that fueled the city's darkest days now powers its future. And no one dares to stop it, because everyone, somehow, benefits from its existence. The politicians. The businessmen. The bankers. Even the ordinary citizens, who simply want life to go on, no matter the cost. Juárez learned that survival doesn't always mean victory. Sometimes, it means surrendering to the system that broke you. Sometimes, it means living quietly beneath the shadow, pretending not to see it move. And in the end, maybe that's how the story of Juárez truly ends. Not with an explosion. Not with justice. But with silence. The silence of progress. The silence of money. The silence of ghosts that never left. Because in Juárez, the shadows don't fade. They adapt. And they wait. Time doesn't heal everything. Sometimes, it just teaches you how to live with the wound. Years have passed since the streets of Juárez ran red. The soldiers are gone. The gunfire has faded. But the memories, they linger, heavy and silent, like dust that refuses to settle. You can walk down Avenida Juarez now and see life again. Shops open. Music plays. Children laugh. To a stranger, it looks like peace. But to those who remember, every street corner is a grave. They remember the days when life was cheap. When a man's worth was measured not by what he built, but by how long he survived. And that memory never really dies. It just hides behind smiles, behind progress, behind the illusion that everything is normal. But the war changed more than the city. It changed Mexico. The government learned that force alone could not kill corruption. Communities learned that silence was a weapon, and that using your voice could be fatal. And the cartels? They learned that power doesn't come from bullets. It comes from control. Control of fear. Control of politics. Control of people. The war for Juarez became a lesson written in blood, one that spread far beyond the border. Cities like Tijuana, Culiacan, and Reynosa would all echo the same chaos in years to come. But Juarez was the warning. The beginning of an evolution. For years, people called it Mexico's longest drug war. But it was never just a war for drugs. It was a war for souls. A war that turned neighbors into enemies, soldiers into ghosts, and a nation into a battlefield with no end. And when the smoke cleared, Mexico was left with a question no one could answer. How do you rebuild a country when trust itself has been murdered? Because the scars aren't only in the streets. They're in the children who grew up hearing gunfire as lullabies. They're in the mothers who still set an extra plate at dinner for someone who never came home. They're in the fathers who stare at the horizon every night, waiting for closure that will never come. 11,000 lives lost. 11,000 stories untold. 11,000 futures erased. And yet, in the midst of that pain, something remarkable survived. Hope. Hope in the mothers who still march every week, searching for the missing. Hope in the journalists who keep writing, even when it could cost them everything. Hope in the young people who paint murals where bullet holes once marked the walls. They refuse to forget. Because forgetting would mean it could happen again. And in Mexico, forgetting is the most dangerous weapon of all. There's a saying in Juarez now. Los muertos nunca se van. The dead never leave. They live in the stories. They live in the silence. They live in every act of courage, every protest, every whispered prayer. And maybe that's what makes Juarez so haunting. Not its past, but its resilience. Because despite everything, the blood, the fear, the betrayal, Juarez still stands. It breathes. It fights. It remembers. And in remembering, it resists. The factories hum again. The city lights burn bright against the desert sky. And yet, beneath it all, you can still feel it, that quiet heartbeat of history. Reminding everyone who listens that peace built on silence is not peace at all. The story of Juarez isn't about victory or defeat. It's about survival. About a city that looked death in the eyes and refused to disappear. A city that lost everything, yet somehow, still endures. But endurance has a cost. Because when you live surrounded by ghosts long enough, you start to carry them with you. In your thoughts. In your choices. In your blood. And that's the legacy of Juarez, a legacy written not by kings or politicians, but by the ordinary people who refuse to be erased. It's a story of power. Of loss. Of rebirth. But above all, it's a story of consequence. Because what happened in Juarez didn't stay in Juarez. It reshaped an entire nation. And its echoes still reach across borders, reminding the world that behind every statistic, every headline, there is a human story, bleeding, broken, and real. The world looked away once. And 11,000 people paid the price. Now, when you hear the name Juarez, it shouldn't just be a headline. It should be a reminder that peace without justice is just another kind of war. That silence can be as violent as a gun. And that sometimes, the dead speak louder than the living ever could. As the camera pans over the city skyline, lights shimmering like stars in the desert, the narrator's voice lowers, calm, reflective, but heavy with truth. Juarez was never just a city. It was a message. A warning carved into the bones of a nation. And that message is simple. When corruption becomes culture and fear becomes law, no one truly wins. Because in the end, every empire built on blood eventually drowns in it. The war for Juarez may have ended within its borders, but its echo crossed oceans. You can still feel it, not just in Mexico, but in every country that ever bought, sold, or consumed the poison that fueled it. The cocaine, the meth, the heroin, they didn't just move through borders. They moved through lives. Through families. Through generations. The fall of Juarez didn't happen in isolation. It was part of a system, one built on demand, profit, and denial. For every bullet fired in Juarez, there was $1 spent in another country. For every body buried, there was a deal made somewhere else, in polished offices, under fluorescent lights, with papers signed and profits counted. And that's the truth few want to face. The war in Juarez was never just Mexico's war. It was the world's reflection, a mirror showing how deep greed can go when humanity turns away. Across the border, in El Paso, people watched the smoke rise from their windows. They saw the chaos, the headlines, the death toll. And yet, life went on, malls full, streets clean, silence comfortable. Just a river apart, two worlds coexisted, one drenched in fear, the other pretending not to see it. The border became more than a line on a map. It became a moral divide. On one side, the dealers, the soldiers, the victims. On the other, the consumers, the politicians, the beneficiaries. Different worlds. Same chain. And as the years passed, the chain only grew stronger, wrapped in money, politics, and denial. Because it's easier to blame the cartels than to admit the truth. The demand that fuels them doesn't come from the desert, it comes from across the border. Every brick of cocaine has two sides, one that kills, and one that pays. And both are guilty. When the U.S. declared its war on drugs, it never imagined that war would spill backward. That the bullets, the corruption, and the despair would ricochet into the very heart of the countries that started it. But Juarez proved one thing. You can't fight demand with force. You can't cure addiction with bullets. And you can't build peace on graves. Even today, as new cartels rise, CJ&G, the remnants of Sinaloa, the splinters of Juarez, the story remains the same. Different faces. Same empire. Same blood. Because the system never stopped. It just got smarter. Cleaner. Global. And so the ghosts of Juarez travel, through shipping ports, border tunnels, nightclubs, and digital wallets. Their fingerprints are invisible, but their presence is everywhere. In the overdoses in American suburbs. In the corruption scandals in Central America. In the quiet deals between businessmen and politicians who will never be held accountable. The war has changed faces, but not purpose. It still feeds the same hunger, power. And yet, despite all this, there are still those who fight. Those who refuse to let the story end in silence. Activists. journalists, families, people who stand on street corners holding pictures of the dead, demanding the world really look at what's been lost. They are the last line between truth and oblivion. And they fight not with weapons, but with memory. Because memory, in a world built on denial, is rebellion. Juarez taught the world that forgetting is dangerous. That every city that looks away, every leader that hides behind politics, every nation that profits from another's pain, all of them are part of the same machine. And maybe that's what makes this story so haunting. Because it's not over. Not even close. Every new generation inherits the same shadow. One built from greed, desperation, and silence. And somewhere, in a border town just like Juarez, it's already beginning again. Different name. Different faces. Same story. The camera drifts over the desert at dusk, the same desert that has swallowed bodies, secrets, and time itself. The wind howls softly, carrying the sound of the city in the distance, laughter, cars, life. And the narrator's voice falls to a whisper. This is Juarez. A city that lived, died, and rose again, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a warning. A warning that no wall, no border, no government can stop what thrives in silence. Because as long as there is profit in pain, as long as there is demand for escape, as long as the world keeps looking away, the war never really ends. It just changes its name. The screen fades to black. The hum of the city fades. And one final line echoes, cold, quiet, and true. Juarez didn't fall because of war. It fell because the world let it. The screen is dark now. No gunfire. No sirens. Just silence. But behind that silence, the story continues, unseen, unheard, and unresolved. Because the war that began in Juarez was never really about territory. It was about people. And people don't disappear when the news cycle moves on. Somewhere right now, a mother is still searching for her son who never came home. A little girl still waits by the door for a father she'll never see again. And across the border, someone is pouring a line on a mirror, never thinking about the blood that carried it there. That's how the cycle survives. Not through violence alone, but through indifference. It's easy to turn the channel. To say it's their problem. To believe that distance equals innocence. But Juarez is more than a place. It's a mirror. And if you look close enough, you'll see the reflection of every city, every government, every person who ever thought silence was safety. Because silence is what allows evil to breathe. And profit is what keeps it alive. The truth is, no cartel survives without consumers. No empire thrives without demand. And no system collapses until enough people stop pretending it isn't their fault. That's why stories like this matter. Because they remind us, behind every statistic, there's a heartbeat. Behind every headline, a name. Behind every war, a human cost. Maybe we can't change the past. Maybe we can't stop the machine entirely. But we can refuse to be part of its silence. That's where it begins, awareness. Not outrage. Not politics. Just awareness. Because awareness is contagious. And once you've seen what hides beneath the headlines, you can't unsee it. So, as the lights fade and the story ends, remember this. Juarez isn't just a city in Mexico. It's a reminder of what happens when humanity becomes a commodity. And maybe, just maybe, the next time we hear about another cartel, another overdose, another war for power, we'll remember this story. And instead of looking away, we'll ask, how did it get here? And what part did we play? Because the truth is, the war on drugs was never fought in the streets alone. It's fought in choices. In silence. In us. In memory of the forgotten. May we never forget again. The credits roll slowly, no sound, no flash. Just names, and a silence that feels heavy enough to mean something.